I'm Brian Lilly. The battle for your money, that is the topic of tonight's byline. So the federal government is on track to deliver a surplus next year, despite the latest promise of tax cuts. That from Finance Minister Joe Oliver, who delivered the fall fiscal update to a business crowd in Toronto earlier today.
Canadians should be proud, not just of our impending balanced budgets, but how we got here. We did not accomplish it by raising taxes or slashing transfers to the provinces, like our predecessors. To the contrary, we repeatedly cut taxes and we increased transfer payments by 55% to $65 billion this year.
Now, this has to be good news. The federal government no longer running deficits, spending's coming under control, and tax cuts. To me, that all sounds good, but if you're a leftist or just an average member of the Ottawa Press Pack, this is all bad news. Let's take a look at how various media outlets were spinning this surplus before Oliver even spoke. It's smaller, due to promised tax cuts the government recently announced. To CBC, their view is a tax cut is another way of spending money. From their story, with the recent small business tax credit, a boost to the children's fitness tax credit, the suite of measures aimed at families announced by Prime Minister Stephen Harper last month, the government has already made new spending commitments of more than $5 billion in 2015-16. Excuse me? What spending? Tax cuts are not new spending measures. They are the government not taking money from taxpayers, leaving money in our pockets. Over at Postmedia, they characterized the tax cuts as eating away at the surplus. From their story on all of this, the new measures are expected to cost the Treasury $4.6 billion in 2015-2016 and about $26.8 billion in total between now and 2019-2020. A recent report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer said the new tax cuts will eat billions of surplus dollars from federal coffers. Let me explain something about surpluses that maybe Postmedia doesn't get. Surpluses are a sign that government is taking too much of our money, more than they need. Just as a government shouldn't spend more than they need, they also shouldn't tax more than they need to. But you know what? As the government has been moving towards balance, well, some people just want to talk about big surpluses. And a big surplus just means the government is taxing Canadians at a higher rate than they need to. Today's fiscal update shows that government tax levels as a percentage of GDP, well, they've been falling. It now sits at about 14% of the economy compared to 18% in the 1990s. Program expenses also falling as a percentage of GDP. That means the economy has been growing while government growth has been kept in check. And that's a good thing, because when the government gets too big, they're a drain on the economy. But according to today's Globe and Mail, the government spending less, well, that's a bad thing. Where'd they get that idea? From the supposedly former, nonpartisan Parliamentary Budget Officer, Kevin Page, who told this to the Globe. Over the long term, however, Mr. Page said that the projection should encourage a debate over whether such low spending rates are sustainable, especially when the provinces will face growing pressures in areas such as healthcare. What's that? He's worried about low spending rates being sustainable? I'm worried about high spending rates. I'm worried about deficits. I'm worried about debt. Now, the Harper government's been far from perfect. They still spend too much. I mean, why do bureaucrats need chauffeurs? Why do they get a car allowance to run departments most Canadians have never heard of? Why do we have an economic development agency handing out government welfare to businesses for every single part of the country? And there's still areas that we can cut in. I don't think that we should have embarked on all the stimulus spending that we did during the recession, the spending the opposition called for. It was billed as temporary. It took years to get rid of. And now that spending stops, as the government reduces jobs, the left-wing opposition, the left-wing media, they're crying out that the government is being cut to the core. If we're really cutting to the core, we wouldn't still have the Canadian Intergovernmental Conference Secretariat. What's that? Well, this is an organization that exists simply to organize government conferences. We wouldn't have the Grain Commission. We wouldn't have so many organizations still funded by government. So when the left cries that the government is getting too small, don't believe it. Even Finance Minister Joe Oliver admitted that today.
There is still too much money in the hands of bureaucracy and not enough money in the pockets of Canadian families.
Tax cuts, though, tax cuts will help change that. Incrementally, government is being rolled back to a more sustainable size, one that Canadians can afford, and more of us are getting to keep more of the hard-earned money we work so hard for. When the other media outlets cheer big surpluses or lament that the surplus won't be as big as they hoped, remember, that means they're cheering for the government to pick your pocket even more, and that gives government more spending power and you less. That's not something I'll ever cheer for. And that's the byline.